Have you ever been so exhausted that you just wanted to disappear? From unfinished dreams, from people who left, from memories you thought had died, but somehow keep growing back inside you? In this video, I'll tell you about the garden we once planted together in Denmark. A place where love sprouted, withered, and then bloomed again in the strangest ways. And maybe somewhere in this story you'll find a piece of yourself too. Arrival in a cold land. You know that strange moment when your body arrives somewhere long before your heart does? That was me, standing at Copenhagen airport with 2 suitcases and a courage I had borrowed from some version of myself I barely recognized. Denmark greeted me with a wind so sharp it felt like the country was whispering, "Are you sure you're ready for this?" And honestly, I wasn't. My life back then looked like a cracked glass. Still holding together, still reflecting light, but one wrong touch and the whole thing could collapse. People think loneliness is loud, but in Denmark it comes wrapped in quietness. The streets were calm, the sky pale, the voices soft. Even the bicycles moved as if they were being considerate. And there I was, this outsider, trying to understand why the silence felt heavier than noise. It followed me into the small room I rented near a lake, where mornings smelled like wet grass and evenings tasted like cold air on my tongue. One morning, after a night of feeling too much and sleeping too little, I walked outside and saw a patch of earth behind the house. Just dirt. Nothing special. But you know how your brain sometimes grabs onto the smallest, strangest idea just so you don't fall apart? Mine whispered, "Plant something." Like the universe was giving me a weird assignment. Grow something in a place where you feel like you don't belong, so I did. I bought a tiny packet of seeds from a kiosk whose owner smiled like he knew I was lost. I remember kneeling in that cold soil, fingers numb, heart numb, pretending that planting something could undo the feeling that I had uprooted myself from everything I understood. But something about the dirt felt grounding, literally. The earth didn't care who I was. It didn't ask why I came. It didn't question whether I deserved to stay. It just waited. There's a quiet magic in the way soil holds a seed. It's like watching hope get swallowed whole, trusting it will return. I pressed the seeds down gently, the way you tuck a child into bed. And for the first time since arriving, I felt a flicker of steadiness. A small one. But small is how everything real begins. I didn't know then that this little garden would become the center of a story much bigger than me. I didn't know someone would soon walk into my life and into this patch of earth, turning it into something unforgettable. All I knew on that first day was this. The ground was cold, the air was colder, but something inside me had started to thaw. The first seed we shared. There's a strange kind of timing life uses, so precise, so absurd, that it almost feels scripted. I was standing in the garden one afternoon, staring at the soil like it owed me an explanation for why nothing had sprouted yet. That's when you appeared. Not dramatically, not like a movie scene with the wind blowing your scarf in slow motion. No. You just walked up beside me with a mug of something warm and said, "It looks like the dirt is thinking." And that was it. That one odd sentence cracked open the quietness around me. You didn't ask who I was or why I was kneeling in the Danish mud like a confused pilgrim. You simply crouched down next to me as if we had always shared this patch of earth. The way you touched the soil, carefully, almost respectfully, made me look at it differently, like it was more than a distraction I'd planted to keep myself from drowning in my own thoughts. Then you pulled a small paper bag from your coat pocket. Seeds. They rattled softly, like tiny bones or tiny possibilities, depending on how dramatic one felt that day. These bloom late, you said, but they bloom beautifully. You spoke in that calm, steady tone people use when they've learned to be patient with life. As if life had tested you enough times to earn your respect, we planted the seeds together side by side, our hands brushing lightly every now and then. And it was ridiculous how such small touches could feel like entire conversations. The ground beneath us was cold, but something between us was not. You talked about growing up nearby, how your mother used to tell you that gardens were love stories disguised as chores. I laughed because I'd never heard anything so poetic and so practical at the same time. You looked at me and smiled like you were glad I understood. When our fingers pressed the last seed into the soil, I noticed something shift. Not in the earth but in me. A softness I didn't expect. A warmth that shouldn't have existed in a country where even summer sometimes feels like an apology. It wasn't romantic yet. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply right. Like finding the missing line of a poem you didn't know you were writing. We sat there long after the work was done, not speaking much, letting the breeze tangle our breath with the smell of damp ground. If someone had told me then that this tiny act, this planting of a few stubborn seeds, would become the beginning of a story I'd replay in my memory for years, I would have laughed. But life loves irony. And sometimes love begins not with a spark, but with two people kneeling in the dirt, quietly choosing to grow something together. Growing in the Danish light. There's something almost suspicious about Danish summer light. It doesn't simply arrive. It lingers, watches, stretches itself across the sky like it has nowhere else to be. You wake up at 4 a.m. and the sun is already peeking in like an overeager guest. By 10 p.m. it still refuses to leave. And somehow in that strange endless daylight, our little garden began to grow, quietly at first, then all at once like it had been waiting for permission. You and I started spending more time there than anywhere else. It wasn't planned. It just happened the way morning dew happens, inevitable and unnoticed until it glistens. We'd sit on overturned crates, drinking lukewarm coffee, watching the tiny green sprouts push themselves upward with the stubborn optimism only plants and foolish humans possess. You talked about light like it was a character in our story. Danish light is gentle, you'd say. It doesn't burn, it persuades. And you were right. It felt like the sun was coaxing our garden into existence, petal by petal, leaf by leaf. I sometimes wondered if it was coaxing us too. There was a rhythm to those days. You watering the right side, me tending the left. You humming songs under your breath. Me pretending I wasn't listening even though I knew the rhythm better than the beating of my own heart. You'd brush dirt off your hands and touch the seedlings like they were fragile truths neither of us was ready to say out loud. And then there were your stories. Strange, lovely, unexpected stories that filled the air like soft pollen. Stories about your childhood summers, your grandmother's cooking, your failed attempts at keeping houseplants alive. I'm actually terrible with plants. You confessed once. An ironic confession while kneeling in a thriving garden. Stories about dreams you hadn't told anyone else. Stories that made me forget, for a moment, that my own heart was still learning how to trust this new gentle light. The garden grew tall. The stems thickened. Leaves fanned out with a confidence I envied. Sometimes I'd look at them and think, how do you grow so boldly in a world this unpredictable? But then I'd look at you sitting cross-legged in the sun, hair catching golden highlights like a secret only daylight knew how to reveal, and I'd think, maybe everything grows better when it feels seen. We didn't say the word love. It would have felt too heavy too soon. But the way you laughed when a blossom first opened? The way you brushed a leaf aside to show me a new bud? The way you stayed even on cold mornings when the wind bit our cheeks? Those moments said everything without making any noise. And as the garden stretched upward toward that endless Scandinavian light, something inside me did too. Something that hadn't grown in a long, long time. The storms we survived. Some gardens grow because of sunlight. Ours strangely seem to grow because of chaos. Not dramatic chaos. No explosions, no cinematic arguments in the rain, but the quiet, inconvenient kind life specializes in. The kind that sneaks in slowly, the way a cold draft finds its way under a closed door. It started with the weather because of course it did. Denmark has a talent for pretending it's calm, and then ambushing you with a storm that feels like the sky is having a nervous breakdown. One moment we were admiring a new blossom. The next, the wind swept through with the emotional subtlety of someone slamming a door mid-argument. And there you were, holding down a tarp like a warrior in a losing battle, yelling, "It's just a little wind!" While the garden bent sideways like it was reconsidering its life choices. We tried everything, ropes, stones, even me attempting to shield the plants with my body, which you said was heroic but mostly looked like I was hugging air. The storm didn't care. It tore petals, snapped stems, flung soil into places soil was never meant to be. I remember watching you gather broken leaves into your hands, your expression soft but unshaken, as if storms were just part of the deal. Maybe they were. But the real storms weren't the ones in the sky. Sometimes it was a misunderstanding, small and stupid, the way tiny stones can trip you more easily than boulders. Sometimes it was the silence between us, longer than usual, heavier than necessary, like the air didn't know which of us should break it first. And sometimes it was me retreating into my own head the way people crawl under blankets when they're overwhelmed. You noticed? Always. But you never pushed. You just sit beside me in the garden, pulling weeds with the delicacy of someone defusing a bomb, waiting for me to find words again. And eventually I did. The garden struggled, then healed, then struggled again. So did we. But every time a stem broke, we propped it up. Every time rain drowned the soil, we dug channels to save the roots. Every time the wind tore something away, we planted something new. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't tidy. But neither were we. And then there were the days right after the storms, the miracle days, when the sun returned and the garden looked almost proud of itself, as if surviving had made it more beautiful. You'd point at a damaged plant showing a new leaf and say, "See? It's tougher than it looks." Sometimes I wondered if you were actually talking about us, because standing there side by side in muddy shoes and mismatched jackets, we looked like two people who didn't know exactly what they were building together, but were equally scared to lose it. And maybe that's how storms test love, not by destroying things but by revealing what refuses to break. When the leaves started falling, there's a specific kind of sadness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't burst through the door or collapse dramatically on the kitchen floor. No, real sadness is polite. It arrives the way autumn does in Denmark. Quietly, subtly, pretending nothing is wrong while everything gently, softly, begins to change color. I first felt it in the garden. Not in you, in the garden. The leaves that once reached toward the sun started curling inward, as if protecting themselves from something I couldn't see. The air grew cooler. The soil held moisture longer. Even the light, your beloved gentle Danish light, seemed to retreat earlier each day, as if it too sensed something shifting between us. You were still there, of course. Still kind. Still showing up with warm drinks and half-finished stories. But something in the way you placed your mug down felt different. Something in the way you looked at the horizon lingered too long. Something in your smile seemed borrowed from a person who had once stood exactly where you stood now. Sometimes love doesn't leave all at once. Sometimes it performs a quiet rehearsal long before the final act. That I remember watching you one afternoon, crouching beside a plant we both adored. The stubborn little one that bloomed late, the one whose seeds you had brought. You touched its fading petals with a tenderness that felt like a goodbye whispered in a language the heart understands before the mind does. You didn't say anything dramatic. No trembling confessions, no poetic melancholy. You just sighed, barely audible, the kind of sigh that carries the weight of a decision someone hasn't fully made yet. And the wind? The wind noticed. It slipped between us more easily than before, scattering dry leaves at our feet as if trying to show us what was coming. That I tried to ignore the signs. Humans are remarkably good at denial. We can convince ourselves that a falling leaf is just a leaf, not a warning. So I watered the soil more carefully. I checked the stems for life. I asked about your day with exaggerated brightness, as if enthusiasm could patch invisible cracks. But the garden doesn't lie. Reflects what we hide. The more the plants faded, the more your voice softened. The less sunlight we had, the more your eyes seemed far away. You were still near me physically, but part of you had already begun packing its bags. Not out of cruelty, never that. Just quietly, instinctively, the way animals sense the first drop in temperature before winter arrives. One evening, a leaf drifted down and landed on my shoulder. You brushed it off gently, and for a split second, your fingers lingered with a tenderness that felt like an apology for something you hadn't yet done. Maybe love doesn't end. Maybe it simply changes seasons before we are ready. The day you walked away. Some moments arrive in a way that feels suspended, like the world forgot to move forward. That morning the air was crisp, the sky overcast, and even the birds seemed reluctant to begin their day. You didn't speak much. Your bag was packed, resting quietly against the door as if it had absorbed your hesitation. I knew, though I tried not to, that this was it. We walked to the garden together. The one we had nurtured from uncertain seeds into a small breathing life. The leaves whispered in the breeze, yellow and brown, still clinging stubbornly to what little life they had left. I wanted to say something monumental, something that could pause time, rewrite history, or at least soften the blow. But words failed, hiding somewhere beneath the knot in my chest. You knelt down beside the last sprout, brushing a soft finger along its tiny stem, and for a moment I thought you were tending to the plant. But I realized you were tending to the memory of us. Our quiet afternoons, our laughter over coffee-stained gloves, our hands brushing in the soil. Each touch seemed deliberate, a final acknowledgement of something neither of us had admitted aloud. That this garden had been more than dirt and seeds. It had been us. When you finally stood, you didn't look back. Not really. Just a small glance, almost imperceptible. And then the door closed behind you with a gentle click. The sound echoed through the empty rooms, through the empty garden, through the hollow that had been filling in my chest for months. I stayed there, surrounded by plants that had survived storms, wind, and cold. Yet none of that resilience mattered against the sudden absence of your presence. It was as if the entire garden paused, holding its breath alongside me. The light that had once danced on the leaves now seemed subdued, filtered through the gray sky. A mirror of the quiet ache I carried. I wandered the paths we had traced together, touching the soil with trembling fingers, feeling the cold dampness seep into my skin and somehow into my heart. There was anger, a fleeting one, quickly drowned by sorrow, by disbelief, by the longing to rewrite a story that could no longer be rewritten. I whispered apologies to the plants, as though they could forgive me for failing to hold on to what had been beautiful. And yet, even as the cold settled into my bones, there was a strange clarity. Love, I realized, is not always about holding on. Sometimes it is about letting the other person grow, even when it means leaving your hands empty and your heart aching. That day the garden remained. The soil remembered, the leaves remembered, and slowly, painfully, I began to remember too. Not the pain alone, but the beauty of what had been planted together. Spring returns quietly. Time has a strange way of moving when you're broken. In Denmark, winter seems eternal, stretching its gray fingers into every corner of your life. I walked through the garden alone for weeks, the soil hard and unyielding, the air heavy with memories that refused to leave. And yet, as all winters do, it began to relent, not with a dramatic announcement but quietly, almost shyly. The first hint of green appeared in a forgotten corner. A tiny shoot, fragile and uncertain, daring to rise through the frozen earth. I knelt beside it, surprised by a small smile that felt like permission to breathe again. Life, it seemed, didn't care about heartbreak. It simply continued, insisting on its persistence. As stubborn as we had been in planting that garden together, that I started returning more often, brushing the soil, clearing leaves that had lingered through the frost, and tending to each fragile sprout. It wasn't the same as when you were here, of course. The laughter, the shared glances, the small jokes about overwatering or muddy gloves, those were gone. But there was a rhythm to this quiet work, a sense that healing could happen even without grand gestures or dramatic reconciliation. Sometimes as I worked, I imagined you walking beside me, your fingers brushing a leaf, a knowing smile on your lips, your voice murmuring something ordinary yet comforting. The garden absorbed these fantasies, holding them as a gentle memory, a soft echo of what once was. And in this imagined presence I found a strange solace. Spring arrived in increments. The days lengthened, sunlight returned, and the air smelled of thawing earth and hopeful beginnings. I watched buds bloom where frost had tried to erase them, realizing that resilience often masquerades as quiet persistence. The garden had survived storms, seasons, and even our absence from each other. If it could endure, perhaps so could I. There were moments when I laughed softly at myself, talking to a plant as if it were a companion, tracing the paths we had walked together, replaying our old jokes in the silence. It was absurd, yes, but also necessary. The garden was teaching me something I hadn't realized I needed, that life and love do not always demand perfection, only attention and patience. And slowly, over weeks and months, I began to notice something remarkable. The soil, once hardened by loss, softened. Leaves unfurled in shapes I hadn't remembered. Tiny blooms appeared, pale and hesitant, and yet undeniably alive. They reminded me that even when someone leaves, when seasons change, and when hearts break, life quietly insists on returning. Spring didn't roar. It tiptoed. And in its gentle persistence, it whispered a truth I had almost forgotten. Healing, like growth, often comes quietly, one small green shoot at a time. What still grows in my memory, even now years later when I pass that quiet patch of earth in Denmark, it feels like stepping into a memory that refuses to fade. The garden we planted together has changed. Some plants are gone, replaced by new growth. Some blooms return each year, stubborn and familiar, carrying whispers of what once was. And in that rhythm I recognize the most enduring truth. Some love, like seeds, continues to grow long after the hands that planted it are gone. I often close my eyes and remember your fingers brushing soil, the warmth of your hand against mine, the small laughs over our shared clumsiness. Those moments are no longer about longing or loss. They are about remembrance, a quiet celebration of what existed, what endured, and what transformed into something subtle but vital. Every leaf, every petal, every subtle shade of green becomes a letter in an ongoing story written between the earth and memory. There's a peculiar comfort in understanding that love does not always demand possession. Sometimes it lingers in the scent of a flower, in the sunlight that slips through trees, in the fragile shoots that push through soil long after the gardeners have left. I've learned that the most beautiful growth often comes unobserved, unnoticed except by those who choose to see. The garden remains a testament, a soft archive of emotion, resilience, and hope that I walk slowly along the paths we once traced together, listening to the rustle of leaves as if they speak a language only I can understand. Sometimes I hear laughter, not exactly yours but shaped by your memory, and it reminds me that connection is never truly gone. It merely shifts form, moving from hands and voices to soil and light, to the quiet space between moments. And I think about what this teaches me, that we can carry love in ways that are invisible yet powerful. That loss does not erase what was planted, that a heart, like a garden, can continue to nurture and grow even in the absence of the ones who first made it bloom. It is a lesson in patience, in acceptance, in the subtle art of allowing something precious to exist without demanding it return. Sometimes I laugh softly, remembering how stubborn we were, how ridiculous, how perfect in our imperfection. And in that laughter, I realize that the garden and the love it represents is no longer something to mourn. It is something to carry, something to honor, something that still grows quietly, persistently in memory. The garden we planted together will never be exactly the same, but neither will I. And perhaps that is the point. That love, once planted, continues its work silently, teaching us that beauty, connection, and growth are not bound by presence, only by remembrance.